Imagine you get 2 free tickets on a cruise to an exotic locale of your choice. Who do you bring with you? Now that you've picked the person, imagine that you and that person are standing next to each other on the deck of the ship, leaning against the railing, looking out over the scintillating blue waves, watching them rise and fall. And you notice one wave that rises and rises and rises, and suddenly you realize it's a tidal wave. It's about to rock the ship. You grab onto the railing as the tidal wave slams into the ship and barely hang on. And when the ship rights itself, you look down on the water and you see over off to your left, there's your loved one, struggling to stay afloat on the point of drowning. Over to your right are a dozen strangers, other passengers on the ship that you've never met. You're the only one left on the deck close enough to a lifeboat to throw it out. And you have to choose. Do you save a dozen strangers or do you save your loved one? For the purpose of this thought experiment, those are the only options. Either your loved one dies or a dozen strangers die. What do you do? So this is a variation on a thought experiment proposed by Bernard Williams. This variation comes from Beth Tropman, who taught an ethics class that I took. Now, Bernard Williams' example was a much simpler choice. A man's wife is drowning over here, and a single stranger is drowning over there. Now, it seems obvious in that case that he should save his wife. But why? Bernard Williams' point was that the systems of morality that exist in philosophy, especially contemporary Western philosophy, are impersonal and universalizing. Neither Kantian nor utilitarian ethics would give you a reason to choose one or the other. Utilitarian ethics says you should do whatever action is going to create the largest amount of happiness and the least amount of suffering for everyone in the world. So if we assume that both people have the same number of loved ones who will be sad that they die, there's no ethical reason why a man should choose to save his wife rather than a stranger. Kantian ethics says that you should act according to the maxim that you can will, everyone should follow. Now here, maybe you could make an argument that Kantian ethics slightly favors saving your wife, but what Bernard Williams wants to say is that even thinking about utilitarianism or Kantianism at that moment where your wife is drowning is one thought too many. That these kind of moral systems shouldn't even come into play in a moment like that. Bernard Williams is saying that these kinds of rational moral systems alienate us from our relationships and from our character. Now, what does he mean by character? Well, in another paper, he uses a different example of a man who's a chemist and his wife is very sick and he's poor and he's having trouble finding a job, and he gets offered a job producing chemical weapons. Now, he is fundamentally opposed to chemical weapons, but the person offering him job says, well, the reason I'm offering you this job is because the other candidate is totally gung-ho about chemical weapons, and he'll do a much better job making really horrible chemical weapons than you will. You'll exercise some restraint in this job, whereas he won't. Here, Bernard Williams is specifically targeting utilitarianism, because a utilitarian would have to say, obviously you have to take the job because you're creating less harm and suffering by taking that job than by not taking it. You know, when you take the job, you're able to take care of your wife, you get out of poverty, and you're reducing the amount of harm done by chemical weapons. But if you have a fundamental opposition to chemical weapons, that's part of your character structure. You have a value that you're compromising, that you're betraying by making that decision. Peter Railton, who is a utilitarian of a certain type, came up with a very interesting response to that article by Bernard Williams. He articulated what he called sophisticated consequentialism, which is basically the idea that a person might do more good over the course of their life by sometimes making choices that align with their values and their character, but don't do the most good in that particular situation. So Railton uses the example of a guy who has to fly from where he lives with his wife to where he works. And he spends like 2 weeks away and 1 week back. His wife gets sick. It's not a life-threatening illness, but she would love to have him home. And he has the choice to either fly home that weekend that he would normally stay where he works and spend that money to fly home, or write a check to a charity. Writing the check to charity will lead to more happiness and relief of suffering than flying home to be with his wife, who will be okay, but just would prefer to have him there. Peter Railton is saying it's possible that even though in that specific circumstance, flying home to be with his wife is the wrong thing to do from a utilitarian perspective, being the sort of person who would fly home to see his wife may lead him to make more decisions in his life overall that will lead to a better outcome overall. So all of this gets to this very, very old question. How do we balance our obligations to those close to us, to family, to friends, with our general obligations to everyone? This was also a big debate in ancient China between the Confucians and the Mohists, the followers of Moh Tzu. The Confucian Mengzi, also known as Mencius, made the argument that where we learn virtue in the first place, where we start cultivating virtue in the first place, is in the family. So it makes sense to focus on the family first and then expand the virtue out from there. Whereas Moh Tzu said that we should be totally impartial, that we shouldn't favor our family over others, because being totally impartial is what leads to the most good for the most number of people. Now, this is something that I personally have struggled with. I tend to be someone who looks at the big picture, who is committed to cosmopolitanism, to seeing everyone as equally valuable. And this has sometimes led to me not prioritizing my family. Now, I've ultimately come to favor the approach of Mengzi or Peter Railton, to see how prioritizing the family creates that foundation that allows me to do more for the world, for a couple of reasons. One reason is that my marriage is the relationship that I spend the most time in. It's where I have the most opportunities to actually cultivate the virtues and the character that will lead me to be better out in the world. And it also, if I don't attend to my marriage, then it ends up draining a lot more of my energy and of my wife's energy than if I do. So if I ignore what's close to me in order to focus on what's far away from me, then I actually end up having less energy to focus on what's far away from me. Whereas if I focus on what's close to me and create a relationship that feeds me and feeds my wife, then we both have more energy to make the world a better place. And a third reason is that by focusing on the home and the family, I create an environment for my son where he can learn from my example and my wife's example of using our relationship as a place to cultivate virtue. Because Aristotle says that virtues are created by habit. One learns to be courageous by doing courageous actions. And the best time to learn virtue, according to Aristotle, is as a child, to be brought up with the habits of doing virtuous action. And so I have a much bigger impact on my son than I do on random people out in the world. And by creating an environment that models the cultivation of virtue, I not only have the impact on myself and on my wife and on the people that I can affect and the people my wife can affect, but also all the people that my son will affect throughout his life. What do you think? Is all of this thought even necessary? Or, like Bernard Williams, is this just a whole bunch of thoughts too many? How do you balance care for family with care for the world?